Don't get so excited yet. You haven't heard anything yet. And in fact, Candy's made me very nervous because I don't think there's, and my friend Colin Jackson in the audience will probably agree that I don't think there has ever been anyone in history who has left an event where I'm speaking happy or delighted. So we'll see how all this plays through, shall we? First of all, thank you, Candy. Thank you not only for that generous introduction. Boy, that sounds way better when she says it than when I say it. Sort of got me right here. But thank you not only for the introduction, but thank you for all the work you've done and your team has done on putting together this marvelous conference. It's my first time, and what an amazing experience. And I've been particularly happy that I've been able to be here from beginning to end, which is a little uncommon in my new world. But it's really given me the opportunity to be a fly on the wall for so many magnificent discussions. So thank you all for sticking through until the bitter end. I should warn you that given that I've been here for 3 days, I'm actually on vacation, which is how I got away with being here for 3 whole days. And given that I've been here for 3 days, it means it's probably about 5 days since I've stood behind a podium and made a speech. I'm a little worried I've forgotten how. But we will muddle through it together. I've been asked to do a few things in this closing session for this weekend. The first is to reflect on what I've heard and what we have heard. So I'll do a little bit of that. Candy also warned me that I had to be provocative, which for those of you who know me is extremely challenging for me. But I'll try. I want to tell you a little bit of my story, not because I'm particularly fascinated with my story, but other people seem to be. And I think there may be some lessons in there for us. And then I want to talk a little bit about where we go from here. What does future civic engagement look like? What does it mean? And how can we make some of the things we've heard really become real as we move forward together as a community and as a country? So for the past 3 days, I've been a little fly on the wall trying to take notes on my fancy schmancy iPad, which is over there, you'll notice. I usually speak without notes. It's sort of one of my trademarks. But when they told me that I had to synthesize what other people said, I was like, I better write it down. I want to make sure that I get some of it right anyway. But we've heard a lot of very, very interesting things. But I got to tell you something. This is the provocative part. I'm warning you now. I feel a little unsatisfied. I feel a vague sense of not quite being full, and that's not just because I'm fasting. And the challenge, I think, for me has been that we have heard a lot about the need for change. We've heard a lot about people needing to use their voices more, about how our institutions are not particularly aligned with the voices of the citizens that they claim to serve. What's left me a little bit unsatisfied, though, is the tenor of some of the responses that we've heard. And they've ranged from, we do this all the time in the nonprofit sector, so I'm particularly attuned to it. If only people knew the good work we did better, then life would be so much better. If only people understood what we did, life would be so much better. True, I suppose, but it also has incorporated in an element of blaming the citizen for not knowing, for ignorance of the great things that are going on their behalf. And again, it leaves me a little bit uneasy. We've heard some responses that are a retrenchment to ideas that work at the level of policy. You know, for example, we heard that the solution, one of the solutions for the shocking issues we have with our First Nations people is a return to constitutional discussion. I'm not convinced I believe that. I'm not convinced that I don't believe that the right way to deal with some of the issues, particularly of poverty that are faced on First Nations areas, are in fact to deal with the issues of poverty that are held on First Nations areas and for urban Aboriginals, rather than to continue our discussions at the level of policy and what we've done wrong. So all of this sort of, oh, and then one more, right? Sometimes we hear that the world has changed so much, that the rules have changed so much that it's impossible for us to be able to continue operating the way we've operated. But that the response may be that if the rules have changed, what we should do is we should abandon the values that caused us to put those rules in place in the first place. For example, the right of creators to have some value over the stuff that they create. You know, if copyright law doesn't work for us now, is the solution really to say that creators ought to have no protection? I don't know. And I think that these are the kinds of discussions that are important discussions to have, and we're in a place, and we're lucky to be in a place where we can have these sorts of discussions. I believe that there may, in fact, be better ways for us to be able to move forward together. And that really takes me back to the first conversation that we had when we were listening to Jay Nadeau speak. And he said that we can do nothing without citizen engagement, right? He said to us in Josha, Amandala Awelu, the power to the people, power back to us. And I think that that is an important thing for us to dwell upon. But we'll get back to all of that. I wanted to start off with some provocations to make sure you were awake after lunch. And we'll come back to some of those things. I want to tell you, though, a little bit of my own story. I am in many ways an extremely unlikely politician. It is actually still very difficult for me to describe myself as a politician. But I tell you that I grew up in a family and in a community, as you heard, that valued beyond anything else the absolute ethic of community service. Even if you don't have anything, there's someone else who's got less. And it's important to share what you do have, whether that's your resources, your skills, your ability to make change. And so I grew up in that ethic, and I did a lot of that for a long time. And then I moved to Toronto. Which may or may not have been related. I started my career after university in Toronto in a big corporate job. I value to an unbelievable amount the skills that I gained in that work. I use them every single day. And they are deeply rare skills. The ability to solve problems, the ability to synthesize, the ability to disaggregate and reaggregate issues and so on. I use them every single day. I worked very hard and I learned a lot. But what I didn't do was get very engaged in the community. In fact, I didn't get engaged in the community at all. It's hard when you're traveling every Monday morning. Got engaged in the security screening community at Lester Pearson Airport, maybe, in ways that I probably shouldn't have, pre-9/11. But I didn't really feel like I lived in Toronto. Sure, I had an apartment there that I visited every couple of weeks, and I had some friends there, and I knew all the best restaurants, thank you, Toronto Life. But I didn't really feel like I was doing much there. And there was a civic election at the time I was there. And it was one of those civic elections that comes along, and sometimes they are like this, where there was no real competition for the incumbent mayor or for the incumbent councillor. And it just so happened that I was traveling on the day of the election, and I was also traveling on the advanced poll days. And in another instance, had I still been the guy I was when I was still in Calgary, I probably would have really worked hard to figure out a way that I could vote. You know, delay my travel, figure out a way to vote by mail, do something. And I looked at the whole thing and went, well, I don't even really know who my councillor is, and the mayor's only facing token opposition, so I'm not going to bother voting. It's the only election in my life I've not voted in. But I remembered that, and when it came time for me to leave my corporate life, I left without really having a great idea of what I wanted to do next. But I knew I wanted to go back to Calgary, and I knew that I wanted to somehow get more involved in the community. And I had the very good luck at that time to be working with a woman. I was actually her boss, a fact that I remind her of to this day, called Alison Lote. And Alison was starting an organization called Canada 25. And the work that she was doing on the side of her desk was so much more interesting than the boring work we were doing in the office that I ended up giving her more and more and more time to work on her side project, to the point where I, her boss, ended up doing all her photocopying for her for this project. Don't get me wrong, I am very, very, very good with a photocopier. Something that surprises my staff to this day. Fax machine too, but those skills are less in need now. And I was able to get involved with this remarkable group called Canada 25 that she was starting that was really looking at helping people between 25 and 35 get more engaged in their communities through the lens of public policy. And I had the chance to do that, and I had the chance to coordinate a process of young Canadians living in cities around the world asking themselves the question, how can Canadian cities be better? And the result of that was a little book that I helped write called Building Up, Making Canada's Cities Engines of Growth and Magnets of Development. I got that backwards. Oh my God. Just got the title of my own book backwards. Obviously, 6 days since I've spoken at a podium. Anyway, Building Up. And suddenly I found myself as an urban expert. And this really allowed me a bit of a platform to again try and get people more engaged. And it led to the creation of an organization in Calgary called the Better Calgary Campaign, when I realized, along with many colleagues, that in order to make change, we have to make change at the government level. politics matters. And the Better Calgary campaign became a lobby group to try and improve the quality of our municipal government. Later, I had the opportunity, and I'll tell you the whole story, it's sort of a funny story. I went to see a great author, a remarkable author by the name of Chris Turner, a Calgarian who's written a book called The Geography of Hope. He's also written a book on The Simpsons, by the way. Both are good in different ways. But The Geography of Hope is about how communities around the world have adapted to issues they are facing as a result of climate change. It's very optimistic, the title, right? The Geography of Hope, about how to move forward. So I went to see Chris read. I'd never met him before. And I went to get my book signed afterwards. And Chris said, when he saw me, he's like, "Oh, I know who you are. You're the loudmouth civic activist." Sort of like Dave Meslin, no, only not as cute. And he signed my book with, "Let's get started." A couple days later, I receive a phone call from this guy saying, "I'm getting a bunch of people together in a coffee shop tomorrow morning. Can you make it? And we're going to talk about the future of Calgary." And luckily, I was a professor, and we don't really do much work. So I was able to make it at 10 o'clock the next morning. And sitting in this coffee shop with these very eager people, none of whom I had met before, talking about how they wanted to change Calgary, and they were going to start changing Calgary by having a conference focused on, modeled after those conferences in the tech industries that don't have any agendas, right? They're called unconferences. And so they decided they were going to have one, and they were going to call it Civic Camp. And 6 weeks from now, from that date, they were going to rent a room in the basement of a church, because all good things start in church basements, and they were going to have a ton of people out. And I was looking at them going, so in 6 weeks, they want to raise $10,000, they want to have this event, they want to have an impact on the rest of the city. Great. But I didn't want to say anything, because one should be nice to crazy people. And so I took on a volunteer role. The volunteer role was that I had to create the online registration system for attendees, which I did by Googling online registration system. Free. And I did find one. And when we made that live, I didn't even get a chance to send out the link to my own contacts and my own friends, because I was busy and I thought I'll do it in a couple of days. And the event sold out in 12 hours. 200 people wanting to come to this event to talk about the future of their city. And that was the creation of an organization. We never did come up with a name for the organization. So the organization is just called Civic Camp after the event. And the folks at Civic Camp have had a remarkable, remarkable impact on the city. For the first time, there is an organized group of citizens who have no particular axe to grind, who just care about a better community, and who are trying to work to create a better community. And so one of the things that I did with Civic Camp is I was trying to convince them that, much like the Better Calgary campaign, they needed to be more engaged in politics. So I said, you know what a great role for Civic Camp would be? You should organize an all-candidates debate in every single ward and a giant mayor's debate. And they all said, that is a ton of work. And I said, don't worry, I know how to do it. We can do it together. And then I decided to run for mayor. They were really angry. But they organized 15 debates in Calgary, one in every riding, and a giant debate at the University of Calgary for the mayoral candidates. Over 1,500 people in attendance. No debate had ever been that big before, plus webcast to untold thousands more. The server crashed. And all volunteers, zero money, just trying to make a difference in their community. And I was almost more proud of them than I was of myself during that campaign because of what they were able to do. But I was also kind of busy running for mayor. And the reason I was running for mayor is because I had spent most of 2009 trying to convince other people to run for mayor. Because I was determined, I was bound and determined that in order for us to have change in our communities, we needed to have people who were willing to take on the role of public service. So every single day, really, I would go out and I would try and convince community leaders, I would try and convince business leaders and people from the nonprofit sector and activists and young people and older people that they should really think about putting their careers on hold for a little while and engaging in public service. I struck out every time. No one wanted to do it. Doesn't pay enough. Too much work. Don't want to be in the public eye. And in particular, by the way, I had a lot of trouble convincing women to run. And part of that is just a generational thing. I happen to be at the age where a lot of people have young families. And most of the women in my social circle have young families, and they said, this is not the time for me. But I had an enormous amount of trouble doing it. And so finally, well, there's a very long and funny story that I'll tell only if someone asks it in a question. I ended up realizing that since no one else was going to do it, someone had to draw the short straw. But, contrary to popular opinion, I didn't jump into this naively, thinking, oh, if I'm in there, I'll elevate the level of debate, or I'll bring issues to the table that won't otherwise be at the table. It took me a long time to decide whether to run. The day that the former mayor agreed to, or not agreed, announced that he was going to step down, I happened to be in Vancouver at the Olympics. I was standing in line with a Calgary guy who I barely knew for a Japadog. Do you know Japadog? It's a great street cart in Vancouver. And the reason I was standing in line with this guy was because he had posted on Facebook that he was in Vancouver and he was looking to have some great foodie experiences. He's a big foodie, and did anyone want to join him? And so I had some time before my curling. So I went to stand in line in the rain with him at Japadog. Why is that funny? Ethnic people can like curling. Okay, I only went to my first curling match at the Olympics, but now I love it. Women's curling. And yes, I did in fact ask the question, were they always that hot? Never mind. There is a reason they're all that hot now, but I won't get into it now. Anyway, I talked to curlers. They explain these things to me. HDTV. So, moving on. Standing in line at Japadog in the rain, I get a phone call saying that the previous mayor has announced his resignation. And by the way, all the media are starting to circle saying who's going to run. So who did I come up with? And the answer is I hadn't come up with anybody yet. And so I get a call from one guy saying, listen, it's important that early on, and this guy's not, he's a political guy, he's a political volunteer, but he's not a, doesn't live and breathe politics. But he called me and he said something very intuitive. He said, it's important that early on, it's not seen that only the usual suspects are going to run for mayor, because then we won't get anyone else to run for mayor. And so he said, listen, I have an idea. I want to make a Facebook page, Draft Nenshi. And we'll get people starting to talk about the election, maybe talking about you, maybe talking about other candidates. Do you mind if I go ahead and do that? So I said, yeah, and I'm going to curling. Do what you like. And the foodie to whom with whom I was standing in line turns out is a pollster. And a very, very, very smart pollster. So he overheard half of this conversation, and he said, you're running for mayor? And I said, no, he's putting up this Draft Nenshi page. And the pollster, whose name is Brian, said, well, I can see how it might work. And it was a very long line for Japadog. They're really slow. So by the time we got to the front, before my curling, an hour in the rain, Brian and I had thought, this actually might work. What we've got to see is if the money's there, we've got to see if the people are there. That was February. The curling was excellent. Within 2 weeks, that Draft Nenshi Facebook page had more fans than any existing politician in Alberta. And we thought, okay, we may be on to something here. And a lot of folks said, well, that doesn't mean anything. They're like a bunch of 17-year-olds on the internet. They don't vote anyway. I'll come back to that. We had more fans than any other politician in Alberta, but still I was not convinced. I was still trying to find that better candidate. I was still trying to find that ideal candidate. And I was still talking to a lot of people. And it wasn't until everyone had rejected me, story of my life, but it wasn't until I realized that as I was talking to people and more of them were saying, well, why don't you just do it yourself? Why don't you just do it yourself? That I realized, if I'm going to do this, I'm not doing this to waste a bunch of my time and a bunch of other people's money to elevate the debate. I'm only doing this if I can win. And I realized, something, there is a chance to do it. So a lot of folks, when we first announced, thought, what's he doing? There's no way he can win. But the one big secret that people don't know about what happened in our campaign is it was an incredibly disciplined political campaign. And we had our strategic plan from the very beginning. I'm a strategist by profession, so I know how to do that. And we executed on that with more discipline than I've ever seen an organization execute on a plan before. That wasn't me, that was the team, all volunteers, all volunteers. And they were able to just make it happen. So a lot of folks, after I was elected, a lot of ink was spilt and a lot of folks wrote about how did Nenshi win? And what happened? None of them bothered to ask me. I do have an opinion on the matter. And so I'm going to share it with you. 3 things happened. The first thing was that we actually had very fertile ground because of Civic Camp, because of the Better Calgary campaign, and because of millions of other conversations that had started in the city. The people of Calgary were ready for a deep discussion about their future. Now, I'm staring at a guy called Colin Jackson, my co-conspirator from Calgary. And Colin and I started doing a lot of this work back in 2001. We started a little organization that lasted, I think, 3 breakfast meetings. They were good breakfasts, though, called Calgary on Purpose. And the whole point of Calgary on Purpose was simply to say it's okay to dissent. It's okay to have a discussion about what the future is. And in 2001, I'm not so sure it was okay. But by 2010, boy, was it ever okay. You know, I spoke at an event called TEDx Calgary. Calgary has not 1 TEDx, not 2 TEDx's, not 3 TEDx's, but 4 different competing TEDx functions. What's a TEDx? TED is, Meslin, what does TED stand for? Technology, Entertainment, Design? So you should watch Dave Meslin's speech, his TED Talk, as they call them, on TED.com. He only has 337,000 people who watched it. Got a ways to go to catch up to me there, Dave. That is what we would call a complete lie. It's exactly the opposite. Politician now, got to get good at that. So TED is a conference where people do these little speeches that are all on the internet, and don't go to TED.com right now because you'll spend 3 days watching fascinating speeches, except for Meslin's speech, which is fascinating. Go watch that. But the TEDx's are locally organized conferences for people who just come together and talk, right? So we have 4 of them in Calgary. And every one of them you have to apply to attend. You have to write an essay on why you should be allowed to go listen to these people talk, because they're that popular. We have these nights called Couchiching nights, where people stand up and talk with 20 slides for 20 seconds each on a common theme. They did one on Valentine's Day on the theme of love. And I went, who is going to listen to a bunch of random speakers, including one of my campaign volunteers, a professional dominatrix, another funny story, speak on, I learned a lot during the campaign, speak on the theme of love on Valentine's Day. Who's going to do that? They sold out a 500-seat theater. And it wasn't just to pathetic single people like me, I'm sure. So the whole point is that people in Calgary are ready, willing, and able to have that conversation about who they want to be, about the future that they want to dream. And you know, this is nothing new. I spend a lot of my time right now going to 100th anniversaries of things. 1910, 1911, 1912 were Calgary's first big boom year. The population of the city had increased tenfold over a decade. The city had about 40,000 people in 1910. And in 1910, 1911, and 1912, we founded our first college, Mount Royal College, where I later taught, the YWCA of Calgary, the first City of Calgary Parks, the first City of Calgary Recreation Department, the Calgary Stampede, a little party we like to call the Stampede, the Calgary Public Library. And the building that I go to work in every day, a beautiful, beautiful old sandstone building with a giant clock tower, had its 100th anniversary 2 weeks ago. And I sit there and I look at the city hall that I work in, my nice big office, and I go, this is not a city hall that was built for a town of 40,000 people. Right? This was a city hall that was built not for, the people of 1910 built that city hall not for the city they were, but for the city they dreamed of becoming. They built it for who they wanted to be. And I think that that is a good lesson that I remember every single day when I go to work, that we are building our city for who we want to be, but they were willing to have that conversation. They were willing to think about where they were going. And I like to think that now, 100 years later, we're at the same point in our city. We're at the same point about dreaming and imagining and thinking about who we want to be. and how we want to be a great city in the world and a great city for the world. And we are ready to do that. So that was number one. I was planting seeds in a particularly fertile ground. And that's happening in communities across this country. You know, I know people in St. John, New Brunswick who are starting the same conversations. I certainly know people in the north and on First Nation reserves are starting the same conversations about getting together to have conversations about who we want to be. And I know, I keep talking about my new best friend Dave Meslin over there, and boy, do I ever know that we're having those conversations in the city of Toronto. And I think that that is an incredibly powerful thing that we need to be able to capitalize on. That was number one. Number two, I like to think the candidate had something to do with it. My campaign team disagrees. I am, as you can tell, congenitally incapable of speaking in sound bites. It takes me 30 seconds to say my name. Microwave politics are not for me. Some might call that Stéphane Dionism. But because of that, I really pushed very hard to be able to make this election into a conversation with Calgarians. Partially, I was just playing to my own strengths. I don't know how to speak in soundbites, so I can't do soundbite politics. But I also thought that there was a hunger for something deeper, for a deeper form of engagement that people were aching for. And I was willing to say, okay, let's aim for that. Let's aim directly at that spot. So I have a friend who had been on the Edmonton City Council, had been elected to the Edmonton City Council 3 years earlier. He's still there. His name is Don Iveson. Don was elected when he was 29 years old. He knocked off a popular incumbent, and he once showed me his campaign brochures. And for those of you who have worked on campaigns or know anything about politics, if you had seen his brochures, they would have made you throw up. They were beautifully designed, gorgeous, and packed with text, right? 10-point font, full paragraphs, no bullet points to be found anywhere. And he called it politics in full sentences. And so I said, all right. And someone pointed out to me recently that politics in full sentences is not itself a full sentence, but that's okay. So I adopted that mantra. It was always politics in full sentences. To which one of my campaign leaders of the campaign team said, I don't mind the full sentences, but why do there have to be so many of them? And that's what we did. Every week we released a new policy. The policy was released with a 2-page overview, a detailed 5 to 10-page backgrounders. I had volunteers, smart young people, mostly researchers around the world helping me work on these backgrounders, because I'd get an email from someone in Toronto saying, how can I help you? And I said, well, you can research police and crime statistics for me. You can do that from where you are. In fact, my best quick fact checker, the guy who got me back on really quick stuff, was in Belgium. And the reason it works, a friend from Canada 25 Days, a Canadian living in Belgium. And the reason that it works so well is because he would do it overnight, right? My time. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd be ready to go with the new release for the next day, responding to what had ever happened the night before. And so we released those. There were 13 of them in total, 12 of them in total. We called them the Better Ideas. To this day, we still talk about them. This is Better Idea number 8. We're still working on that. And we also, when we released each one of those, released a short video of me explaining it, an audio podcast, and we encouraged people to comment on our website on it, and we never deleted the comments. My rule was, I don't care if you agree or disagree with me, the only thing I'm going to delete is if you're really abusive towards someone else. And I probably ended up deleting 2 or 3 messages over the course of the whole campaign. And people would comment, and sometimes they'd agree, and sometimes they'd disagree, and there's one particular policy where a lot of people thought my idea was a terrible one. But what we saw was that even on that little comment page, they were starting to come together and talk to one another. And sometimes the ideas would improve. Sometimes they get worse. But it really was a sense of creating a bit of community out of all of that. And I think it really worked well. After I won, this phrase, politics in full sentences, got a bit of credence, and people started talking about it all the time, and I felt a bit guilty because I had stolen it from Don. So I made sure that I would always acknowledge Don. I'm a professor, after all. I can't plagiarize. So I always made sure I'd acknowledge Don, and this is where he came up with. And finally, Don weighed in on the matter, and he said, okay, 2 things. It's not politics in full sentences. It's politics in complete sentences. You remembered it wrong. And I said, it's okay, I improved it. I'm a marketing prof. Better brand. And then he said, in number 2, I stole it from the West Wing. I took 10% off for plagiarism off of them. But it was really working. People were really willing to have the discussion at that level. And I think that that was a really big learning for me, that if you give people the respect that citizens can actually grapple with tough issues, if you invite them in and help them understand the trade-offs, pretty soon they drop the axe they're grinding and figure out a way to come up with a better solution. And that's a philosophy, and I'll get back to that, that I've been trying to incorporate as I govern as well. The third thing, we adopted a methodology which a lot of people thought was new politics. You know, oh, look at him, he's the social media guy, and so on. In reality, it's just old politics. One of the first rules of politics is go to people where they live. Don't expect them to come to you. And so we went to people where they lived. I wore out a lot of pair of shoes over the last year. I was in people's homes, in their backyards. I was in church basements, in temples, in synagogues, at festivals, on river pathways, in parks. If people congregated, I would be there. I'd come to the opening of an envelope, as they said. And I learned two very important things. See, in Alberta, municipal elections are always in October. They're always the second week of October. And the third Monday in October. And the conventional wisdom is that the election doesn't really start until Labor Day because nobody's paying attention during the summer. And what we learned is it's true that many people are not paying attention in the summer, but the people who are really engaged in their communities are paying attention 24/7, 12 months a year. And those people were listening and they were paying attention. We called them the hyper-engaged. And all summer we had the hyper-engaged all to ourselves because no one else was engaging with them. No one else was actually using them to bring their own wisdom to the conversation. If we want to just talk about raw politics for a minute. For those of you who work on campaigns, you know this. For those of you who don't, now you're going to learn something about politics. The role of a local election campaign is only one thing. The only job you have while you're running an election campaign is to get names, phone numbers, and email addresses of people that are going to vote for you. That's your only job. And then on election day, you hound the heck out of those people and you make sure they go vote. That's it. That's politics in a nutshell. And the conventional wisdom will tell you, and a lot of people in the room will agree with this, that every name you have in your identified voter list is probably worth 2, 3, or 4 votes. They may convince their spouse or their kids or a couple of friends to come along and vote with them. Our hypothesis is that these hyper-engaged people were the people whose friends would always say to them, who should I vote for? You know who these people are because every one of you is this person. And am I lying? Right? So if you're the kind of person whose friends tell you who should I vote for, you're not shy about telling them who they should vote for either. Right? So that means that you are worth 200 to 300 votes. You're 100 times more valuable to a campaign than a regular Joe in the database. And so by engaging these people in conversation, whether they agreed or disagreed with many of my policies, they all came on board. The other thing that we learned is that a lot of these people and a lot of other people live online. And so the old adage of go to them where they live also meant go to them where they live online. And this gets me back to the 17-year-olds on Twitter and Facebook. So as I always say, and some of you will have heard me say this before, I have a lot of things in common with Justin Bieber. Legions of preteen fans, outstanding hair, complete lack of singing ability, but good rhythm. But what we don't have in common are our Twitter followers. Some of them actually we do have in common now, but you know, sure, there's a lot of preteens who are on Twitter to follow Justin Bieber. But those are not the same people who follow the hashtags for the Couchiching seminar. They're not the same people who follow the city council debates live. Right? It's just a communications medium like any other. So to say that online is where young people go, young, not serious slacktivists go, is like saying television is where kids go because you happen to have Treehouse TV on one day. It doesn't make any sense. It's all a channel, medium. And what we learned was I now have about 22,000 Facebook fans. And Facebook allows you, Facebook's a very powerful tool, very, very powerful tool. And it allows you to know the demographics of who those people are. The average age of my Facebook fans is 34 years old. The average age of Calgary, 34 years old. 600,000 people in Calgary have a Facebook account. It's about the same as the number of adult Calgarians. So these tools are now reaching out across generations, across income divides, into just about everyone. And so we found that using the online tools made a big difference. And then I get asked all the time, can you have authentic dialogue in 140 characters? And strangely, paradoxically, weirdly, it's a fantastic place for authentic dialogue. It's real. One of the other things I have in common with Justin Bieber is that he and I are the only ones who have the password to the Twitter account. So when you see Justin, that's Justin. And when you see me, that's me. And because it's only 140 characters, it's actually very easy for me to respond directly to citizens about things. You know, I don't have to really think about a big response. I can just quickly point them to the information that they need or answer their question very quickly. And I think that that leads not only to an authenticity for me as a politician, but more important, to an authentic sense of involvement in the community. There are drawbacks to this. I'm going to talk about some serious ones in a minute. The big drawback for me is that I appear to be everyone in Calgary's personal 311 service. Sort of like Rob Ford. So I got a pothole on the street in front of my house. Can you fix it, Mr. Mayor? I'll be right there. I got my shovel. Keep a bucket of gravel in the trunk of the car. But, you know, and that's funny, and I will tell you, give you a proper, do this correctly. I'm not tweeting now. You know, I could. But yesterday I got one, which I just love, which I will share with all of you, which was, here we are. And in fact, you guys can help me on this, because I actually have a dilemma. I don't know whether I should respond to this person or not, because I actually do know the answer to their question, but I'm scared of what may happen if I answer it. Here we are. I don't know why I had to pull this out, because I could have just told you what it says. Mr. Mayor, can you recommend a good mechanic? As a matter of fact, I do have a very good mechanic, but I'm a little scared. Who thinks I should answer this person? Okay, who says I should stay far away from the mechanic recommendations? Wimps. But it does continue to work. And so, yes, I won in the end. But the more exciting thing for me than winning was the fact that we created this thing that people call the Purple Revolution. And the Purple Revolution was never, and if you don't know, it's because purple was my campaign color, nothing more exciting than that. But the Purple Revolution was never about winning. That was nice, don't get me wrong. But the Purple Revolution was about giving people voice. It was about bringing people into the community. You know, I was worried when we started the campaign. I was forecasting forward, and those of you who've worked on campaigns will get this. A citywide campaign is a big, big campaign. And I realized, oh my gosh, there are 240 polling stations. That means on election night, this is at the very beginning, I need 240 times 2, 480 volunteers to be scrutineers. Where the heck am I going to find 480 volunteers? And I thought, well, you know, we'll see if you can run a campaign without having scrutineers, because we won't be able to do it. At the end of the campaign, we had well over 1,000 volunteers. And every time I did a volunteer orientation, I would always ask people, is this your first time volunteering on a political campaign? And well over 2/3 said yes. And so we were really able to get into something, and it got very exciting, because before that election, people were talking. People were talking to the person in front of them in line at the grocery store. People were talking to the person sitting next to them on the bus about the election, but more important, about the city, about the community, about the future, about what they were building and living together. And that was unbelievably exciting for me, even more exciting than winning, really. And so the thing that keeps me up at night is, how do we keep that going? How do we ensure that people feel that invested in the future of their community? And I often quote the Aga Khan in a speech he made, the LaFontaine Baldwin speech in Toronto the week before my election. P.S. If you haven't seen this speech, seek it out today. Go and listen to it. It's the most interesting discussion of pluralism in Canada and in the world that you'll ever see in your life, and I think there's a lot of solutions to the world's problems in that. But I want to share with you one quick quote. This is the Aga Khan speaking. Too often, democracy is understood to be only about elections, momentary majorities. But effective governance is much more than that. What happens before and after elections? How are choices framed and explained? How is decision-making shared? So that leaders of different backgrounds can interactively govern rather than small cliques rule autocratically. I quote that almost every speech I make. That's why it sits on my iPhone. Because I think that is really the core question of governance. How do we sustain that, and how do we share decision-making? I'm happy to tell you that it seems to be working in Calgary. Recently, a survey in our local Arts and Entertainment Weekly newspaper asked Calgarians what is the best new trend in Calgary. And in third place was civic engagement. In second place was Mayor Naheed Nenshi. Didn't know I was a trend. In case you're wondering, the worst trend was jeggings. A sentiment with which I thoroughly agree. I wouldn't put too much credibility, though, before you get too excited, I wouldn't put too much credibility in their survey techniques, because when asked who Calgary's sexiest man was, in third place was Brett Wilson from Dragon's Den, in second place was Jerome Iginla, the captain of the Flames, and in first place... So, clearly there was some very, very serious problems with the methodology. People need to up their standards quite significantly. So what have I done with that since the election? That was a long story about the election, but so many folks have been asking me. I thought it would be helpful to get that out. But what have I done since then? And really, how have we tried to govern in the way that we campaigned? I'll give you a couple of very short but interesting case studies. The first is that Calgary Transit had a Twitter account. And the Twitter account was operated, as so many corporate Twitter accounts are, by the people in corporate communications, the PR people. And they worked between 8:30 and 4:30 Monday to Friday, and they would send out press releases about, there'll be a service disruption on such and such a line. And what they learned very quickly was that people kept going back to them from Twitter because they had it on their phone while they were at the bus stop and saying things like, "Where's my bus?" Or, "Did you know that such and such bus has broken down?" And so what Calgary Transit realized, as we're going through this major cultural shift in Calgary of being much more responsive to citizens, what Calgary Transit realized was that this is actually a customer service function, not a communications function. So they transferred the Twitter account into the call center. So the call center agents who work there anyway, we didn't hire a single new person, in addition to answering the phones, would be answering people's Twitters. So if you say, "Harry, where's my bus? I'm at bus stop number so-and-so," you'll get a response in seconds saying, "Oh, there's a problem on the line. Your bus should be there in 5 minutes." Or, "There is no bus." They don't like it when they get that. But the really interesting thing about it is the number, it's human, right? They're real people who are answering. And sometimes folks get abusive with them when there's a big system outage, and I always jump in and remind them, these are human beings, they're doing their job, right? And when Calgary Transit sends things out like, "We know this is the worst possible day and it's minus 30 outside and it's horrible that the C train is disrupted, but we're really trying to get you to school or work." People understand that, right? It humanizes the entire thing. And I think that's particularly important. And I'm really proud of Transit for what they've been able to do there. In my own world, we made a change. It was the right thing to do. We removed a parking fee from our parking lots around our train stations. But we didn't implement it very well. We had a terrible, terrible winter in Calgary. It's not an excuse, but it is true. And there was an April snowstorm. And the snowstorm happened the week end before the fee was removed. So Transit didn't get all their signs up in time. And so the first day was terrible. People didn't know where to park. They didn't understand what was happening. So I put out a message on Twitter and on Facebook saying, how'd the first day go? Share your stories with me. Let me know how we can do a better job. And, a bunch of people said, don't worry about it. It was great. I'm thrilled that you've removed this fee. It's made a big difference. It was the right thing to do. We got a bunch of people saying you never should have done this. But by far the most common response we got was people who said, "Gee, thanks for asking. No one's ever asked before." And that really stuck it to me. Final case study that I will mention is We have a budget process, very, very similar to what's going on in Toronto right now. We have a big, big financial hole we have to fill. But we decided to turn the budget process on its head, and we said, we want to go out to people and find out what their priorities were. And we spent way too much money. We shouldn't have spent that much money. Sorry, Dave, we shouldn't have had the billboard saying come to the meeting. Too expensive. Cheaper ways to get the word out. But we went out there and we said to people, what do you think? We got 24,000 people responding with their ideas about what their priorities were for the city. There's one tool we used. It's actually, truth be told, kind of a stupid tool. But it's called All Our Ideas. And the idea is whatever people suggest end up in this tool, typos and all, and they're served up to the person who goes to the website. It's still up there. Just type in All Our Ideas Calgary in Google if you want to see it. And they're served up 2 at a time. So binary decisions. You have to vote on each one. It doesn't really work for decision making, but it certainly works to get people involved in the discussion. And we stole it from New York City, who did a similar thing for their budget process. Over 6 months, they got, I think, 50,000 votes. We had ours up for 2 weeks. We got 120,000 votes. So people were clearly really getting involved. And this is really how I think we continue this element of how we get people involved. Candy's looking a little nervous, so I should wrap up. But I will say that, Dave Meslin, again, my new best friend over there, talks about how he doesn't believe in apathy. Well, neither do I. And in fact, I have never met an apathetic person. I have never met anyone who truly doesn't care, who doesn't care about the future of their community, of their family, of their neighborhood, of their city, of their country. The challenge we have is that there's a giant disconnect between my own hopes and dreams and fears and challenges for my own future and my family's future and my neighborhood's future, and all those institutions, government, business, nonprofit organizations that are supposed to be helping me make those dreams real. So how do we fix that? Right? How do we repair that disconnect, which I call a form of disempowerment? There's a very good piece in the International Herald Tribune yesterday by a great Canadian author who writes a column for the IHT called Christia Friedland. And she is talking about what happens when people lose faith in their governments. And she quotes a philosopher whose name escapes me. I'll come up with it before when we're answering questions. But he says people, when they become disillusioned, have 2 options. And those options are exit or voice. Either I disengage from the system, and I say the system will never give me what I need, so I'm not going to participate anymore. Or I find a way to bring my voice into the system. And that's really what I think our goal needs to be. Find a way for those voices to be heard. And this can be scary, because we don't always hear what we want to hear. And for a guy like me, who's always right, it's challenging when all these people who are clearly wrong are giving me contrary opinions. But we have to be able to do it. As governments, we have to be able to reconsider who and what we are, and who we serve, and how we serve them. I think that this is tremendously important, as frightening as it may be, that we have to be able to do it. And the best way to do that, I think, is to invite citizens in to be part of the process. I want to give you 2 examples from Toronto, and then I will finish. And the 2 examples from Toronto, one of them is our friend Dave Meslin again. He's done a lot of useful things. But I think the most intriguing thing he's done is a system where he was reading, it was John Street, right, Dave? About a study about traffic counts on John Street that said that, this is the modal split between bicycles, cars, and pedestrians. And Dave was reading it and going, those numbers make no bloody sense. So I'm going to paraphrase the story, Dave. So he figured out what those little clicky things are called, went to Staples and bought them, and got a bunch of volunteers to stand on the side of the street and count. And it turns out the city's numbers were completely wrong. They had completely miscounted the modal split on that street and the need for a bicycle lane on the street. I suspect that if Dave's experiment had resulted in him discovering the city was absolutely right, he still would have told him. Right? And I think this is the key, is that certainly we all have our own interests. We all have our axes. But if we can provide better information to decision makers in a way where the information can be useful then we as decision makers really value that, or should really value that. My second anecdote from Toronto, far be it for me to criticize the city of my birth, but my second anecdote from Toronto was a much less positive one. I found myself obsessed, was it last Thursday, by watching this meeting of this council board. I started watching at 11 p.m. my time. I watched until 3 a.m. my time. And it was, I have many, many reactions. I don't know what to think. But I'm going to tell you one specific thing. There's a young guy who got up, works for the Toronto Parking Authority, and works in a kiosk, gives people change, right? Takes their tickets and so on. And he was talking about one of the recommendations that the consultants had made around whether or not to privatize on-street parking, which has been done only in a couple of places in the world. And he was arguing that he had done the research in Chicago and Los Angeles, and in fact, financially, this was not a smart thing to do. And he was actually did some pretty sophisticated financial analysis. Must have a lot of time in the kiosk. And sort of came back and was talking about how the consultants' reports failed to take into account the long-term NPV of the cash flow stream from the on-street parking, et cetera. It was very, very interesting stuff. And I thought, geez, if I'd been sitting there, I would have been so proud and happy that I had citizens who were willing to do some of that work. Because as I always say, look, I'm a really smart guy. Huh? My counselors are really smart people, most of them. I made that joke recently and one of them was in the room. Luckily, he jumped up and said, yes, most of us are. But together, we're not as smart as the 15,000 people that work for the city. And together, the 15,000 of us are not as smart as the 1.2 million people who live in the city. And together, we can make better decisions. So to me, I saw that guy as a gold mine. And what did we see in the questioning? We saw people on one side of the aisle who tried to use him as a political tool to discredit everything else that was in the consultant report, even though he was talking about a specific thing. And on the other side of the aisle, we saw people who said, did a union send you? You know, are you part of the Socialist Party that's been here all day? And I thought to myself, you know something? Far be it from me to be critical. Never critical. Optimistic, happy, delighted, always. But don't treat people like that on either side of the aisle. Right? If you have citizens that are willing to be a resource simply because they care about a better community, then damn straight value them for that and value the information they bring to the table. Because that's how we build the better community. That's how we build the better community that all of us need, that all of us desire, and that all of us will, in fact, build together. Thank you very much.